Scientists just pulled DNA from a skeleton buried in Valencia, Spain, and what it showed inside stopped the research team cold. That person, buried in a Christian cemetery and recorded as a Christian, was carrying clear North African ancestry in their blood. Ancestry that had been quietly sitting inside families in eastern Spain for over 1,000 years, surviving religious conversions, political purges, and name changes completely invisible to historians until a laboratory in 2025 finally read it. That single discovery, published in the journal Genome Biology by researchers from the University of Huddersfield, upended what scholars thought they understood about who actually lived on the Iberian Peninsula and when. And it is just one piece of a much larger scientific revolution that is now completely rewriting the human story of Spain from the ground up. Because when researchers began systematically extracting ancient DNA from bones buried across Iberian soil, from Ice Age caves in Andalusia to Bronze Age burial mounds in Castile to medieval cemeteries in Valencia, the picture that emerged was nothing like the version in any history textbook. The population of the land we call Spain today was not built by one people. It was not the result of a single founding culture that stayed put and slowly developed over time. It was rebuilt from almost nothing, multiple times, by completely different groups of people arriving from different directions across thousands of years. Some of those reconstructions were so total, so absolute, that entire male bloodlines were effectively wiped from existence within a few generations. And the most shocking part is not how much changed, it is how fast it happened. To understand what the DNA is revealing, you first need to understand why Spain was always going to be a crossroads rather than an island. Look at a map. The Iberian Peninsula occupies the southwestern corner of Europe, pushing out toward Africa with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other. To the north, the Pyrenees Mountains form a wall between Spain and the rest of continental Europe. Imposing, but never sealed. Peoples crossed them in both directions throughout all of prehistory, carrying their genes, their animals, their languages, and their knowledge of farming and metalwork. To the south, just 14 kilometers of open water separate the Spanish coast from North Africa at the Strait of Gibraltar. 14 kilometers. In modern terms, that is a short ferry ride. In terms of ancient migration, it is essentially nothing. That narrow channel has functioned as a crossing point for human movement in both directions for tens of thousands of years. And, along the eastern edge, the Mediterranean Sea operated not as a barrier keeping people out, but as a highway pulling them in. Boats moving people, livestock, seeds, and DNA across its surface with remarkable speed long before anyone started writing anything down. What all of this geography means is one thing. Iberia was never a closed system. It was a target, pulling migration waves from the north, the east, and the south in repeated pulses across thousands of years. That is the foundation every layer of this story is built on. The story starts in the cold. After the last ice age ended roughly 12,000 years ago, as the great glaciers that had covered much of Europe finally retreated northward and the land became habitable again, groups of hunter-gatherers spread across the continent following the warming climate. The people who settled the Iberian Peninsula during this period belonged to a category that geneticists now call Western hunter-gatherers. They lived by following and hunting animals and gathering wild plants. They had no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no pottery, no metal tools, and no writing system, but they had DNA. And because the conditions in some Spanish cave sites were right, that DNA survived long enough for modern scientists to read it. What those scientists found when they finally sequenced these ancient genomes surprised almost everyone. The physical appearance that the genetic data suggests for these early Iberians was almost certainly not what most people picture when they imagine prehistoric Spain. Research points toward dark or very dark skin pigmentation combined with light, often blue, eyes. The lighter skin tone that most people today associate with European populations was not yet common across the continent. It would arrive later, brought in by different people from a different place. The genetic signature of these original Iberian hunter-gatherers is still detectable in modern Spanish DNA. It shows up particularly through mitochondrial haplogroup U5, one of the oldest human lineages that researchers can still find in living European populations today. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable living examples of genetic survival anywhere in Europe. The Basque people of northern Spain and southwestern France carry a measurably higher proportion of this ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry than any of their neighboring populations across the entire peninsula. Their genetic profile, on specific measurable dimensions, sits closer to these Ice Age people than any modern group surrounding them. This is not regional mythology or cultural pride or a story told to make a community feel special. This is what the genetic data directly shows. But why did the Basque preserve this ancient layer so strongly when the rest of Iberia did not? The answer connects directly to what arrived next. A wave of new people so numerically powerful that they fundamentally rewrote the genetic landscape of almost everywhere else in Spain within a span of centuries. Around 7,500 years ago, farmers began arriving on the shores of Iberia from the east, not from within Europe, from Anatolia, the landmass we now call Turkey, moving westward through the Aegean and across the Mediterranean in one of the most significant and consequential migrations in all of human prehistory. These were people who had already mastered the cultivation of wheat and barley, the domestication of cattle, sheep, and goats, and the building of permanent agricultural settlements. They were expanding outward from their homeland in a steady, relentless push westward across the continent. What happened when they reached Iberia was not a slow, gentle blending with the hunter-gatherers already there. It was a demographic transformation. Farming communities spread across the peninsula with striking speed, and with them came an entirely new genetic profile. The incoming Neolithic farmers simply and completely outnumbered the hunter-gatherers who had lived there for thousands of years before them. The earlier population did not vanish overnight. Traces of their genetics survived and mixed in, but numerically they were overwhelmed in most areas. Only in the geographically isolated Basque region, sheltered by mountains and terrain that slowed the agricultural expansion, did the older hunter-gatherer genetics survive in relatively high concentrations. Everywhere else, the farmers dominated, and the genetic impact of that Anatolian migration is still visible in modern Spanish people in a very direct way. Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry represents the single largest component in the modern Spanish genome. Think carefully about what that means. A substantial portion of the ancestry of the average person living in Spain today does not trace back to medieval Spain, not to the Roman era, not to any event in recorded history. It traces back to farmers who crossed the sea from what is now Turkey thousands of years before any European civilization put a single word to paper. There is also a physical dimension to this that most people find genuinely surprising. These Neolithic Anatolian farmers are believed to have carried the genetic variants associated with the classic Southern European appearance: darker hair, brown eyes, olive complexion. Much of what people today think of as a distinctly Mediterranean look has its deepest roots not in the Mediterranean at all, but in Anatolia. The hunter-gatherers left traces, the farmers laid the foundation. But here is where the story takes a turn so dramatic that even experienced researchers struggled to accept it when the data first came in. Around 4,500 years ago, a new group of people began entering the Iberian Peninsula from the north and center of Europe. Their ultimate origins lay in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now Ukraine and Russia, north of the Black Sea. These were nomadic herders, associated by archaeologists with what is called the Yamnaya culture. They had domesticated horses, developed wheeled transport, and built a way of life built around mobility and livestock herding across enormous distances. And they possessed a genetic profile that was completely unlike anything already present in Western Europe at the time. They moved into Europe in large numbers, and they left a mark on the populations they encountered that the ancient DNA record describes as nothing short of an earthquake. A 2019 landmark study published in the journal Science, involving 111 researchers, led by teams at Harvard Medical School and the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, analyzed the genomes of 271 ancient Iberians, spanning 8,000 years, and found something that researchers described as one of the most startling discoveries in ancient DNA research to that point. Before these steppe people arrived in Iberia, the Y chromosome haplogroup associated with them, R1b, was essentially absent from the peninsula. After their arrival, channeled through a network of connected communities identified by archaeologists by their distinctive pottery style, R1b became the dominant male lineage across Iberia. Today, it appears in somewhere between 43 and 87% of Spanish men, depending on the specific region, with the Basques showing the highest concentrations. That shift from near zero to majority dominance did not happen gradually over millennia. It happened fast, within a few hundred years by prehistoric standards. The male lineage of Iberia was almost completely replaced in what the genetic data describes as a sex-biased event, meaning far more incoming men than women contributed to the next generations of Iberians. The men who had carried the older lineages, descendants of the Anatolian farmers and the hunter-gatherers before them, largely vanished from the paternal genetic record. What drove this? The DNA alone cannot answer that question with certainty. But the speed and completeness of the male lineage replacement, which was more extreme in Iberia than in almost any other part of Europe, points researchers toward something far more dramatic than a peaceful cultural exchange. These steppe migrants also brought with them the ancestral roots of the Indo-European language family, the family that would eventually produce Latin, and through Latin, the Spanish language spoken by hundreds of millions of people today. So the next time you hear someone speaking Spanish, understand that there is a thread running through that language back not to Rome, not to ancient Iberia, but to nomads on the grasslands north of the Black Sea 4,500 years ago. By the Iron Age, the genetic foundation of Iberia was largely established. But history had more layers to add. In the centuries before Rome arrived, Celtic-speaking peoples moved into the peninsula, mainly from Central Europe, mixing with the existing Iberian population to produce a hybrid group historians call the Celtiberians. They occupied primarily the center and north of the peninsula, and their genetic echo remains visible today, most clearly in the northwest of Spain, including Galicia, where steppe-related ancestry signals remain notably elevated in modern populations. Then came Rome. In 218 BC, Roman legions landed on the Iberian coast, and what followed was more than 6 centuries of continuous rule. That is not a brief occupation. That is long enough to genuinely and measurably reshape a population's genetic makeup. And it did. Genetic studies show that during the Roman period, the ancestry profile of Iberians shifted noticeably towards central and eastern Mediterranean patterns, meaning that Iberians of the Roman era began looking genetically closer to ancient Italians and Greeks. The movement of people across the Roman Empire was constant, and the territory the Romans called Hispania was completely and thoroughly integrated into that continental network of people, goods, soldiers, and slaves moving in all directions. Then, as Rome collapsed in the 5th century, the Visigoths arrived, Germanic warriors who ruled the peninsula from roughly the 5th to the 8th century. Culturally, their impact was lasting in one very specific and still visible way. The suffix found at the end of so many Spanish surnames today, the "ez" in Rodriguez, Gonzalez, and Fernandez, is a patronymic construction meaning son of, a naming convention that many linguists trace back to Visigothic influence. But genetically, the Visigoths barely registered in the population record at all. Political power over a land does not guarantee genetic influence on its people. Their DNA faded into statistical noise. Their grammar stayed embedded in the language. In 711 AD, something happened that would transform Iberia more profoundly than anything since the steppe migrations thousands of years earlier. An Islamic army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa, and within a remarkably short span of years, had swept across nearly the entire peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom collapsed with a speed that stunned the medieval world. What followed was nearly 8 centuries of Islamic rule across large portions of Iberia, a period known as Al-Andalus, 8 centuries. That is longer than the time separating us today from the Black Death. And it left a genetic mark that modern DNA can still read clearly. But here is where the 2025 research published in Genome Biology by the University of Huddersfield team adds something entirely new to the scientific record, something that even recent textbooks could not have told you. Led by researcher Gonzalo Oteo Garcia, the study analyzed ancient DNA from medieval burial sites in eastern Iberia and found that North African ancestry was already present in the region from the 4th to the 8th century, well before the Islamic conquest of 701 even began. This North African genetic signal then grew and consolidated during the Islamic period, as expected. But what the research showed next was the discovery that has rewritten the understanding of what happened afterward. North African ancestry persisted inside a Christian cemetery in Valencia all the way until the 17th century, centuries after the formal Reconquista, centuries after mass religious conversion, centuries during which the historical record insisted that Spain had been thoroughly reclaimed. People carrying that ancestry had converted to Christianity. They were buried in Christian ground. They were living as Spaniards by every legal and social measure that existed at the time. Their blood told a different story that no document ever captured. Then came the expulsion of the Moriscos beginning in 1609, an event the research team describes plainly as a massive episode of ethnic cleansing in which an estimated 300,000 people who had converted to Christianity were forcibly deported to North Africa. And the genomic data shows exactly what happened next. After the expulsion, the North African genetic signal in eastern Spain dropped sharply and almost completely. Bodies were removed. The genetic bridge connecting Iberia to North Africa, which had been alive and measurable for over 1,000 years, was dismantled by organized human action within a single generation. One additional finding from this research deserves particular attention. The study found evidence of slave trafficking from North Africa into Iberia embedded in the genetic record, a dimension of the peninsula's history that has been historically documented but rarely captured in the actual biological record of the people who lived and died there. What does the full modern genetic picture of Spain look like when you assemble all of these layers together? A major study published in the journal PLOS Genetics, analyzing the DNA of more than 1,400 individuals from across the country, put concrete proportional numbers on these layers and revealed just how dramatically they vary depending on where in Spain you look. The average modern Spaniard carries several distinct ancestry components. Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry accounts for the largest single share, estimated across multiple studies at roughly 40% or more, stretching back to those first agricultural migrants who crossed the Mediterranean thousands of years before Rome existed. Western hunter-gatherer ancestry contributes a meaningful share, generally estimated in the range of 15 to 20%, the faint but persistent echo of the Ice Age people who were in Iberia first. Steppe Bronze Age ancestry typically falls in the range of 20 to 25%, the inheritance of those Yamnaya-connected migrations that rewrote the male lineage of the entire peninsula. North African and Middle Eastern ancestry contributes a share consistent with other studies, generally estimated at roughly 5 to 10% nationally, the genetic signature of nearly 8 centuries of Al-Andalus. Roman, Greek, and Germanic ancestry accounts for the remaining smaller fraction. But that national average is only part of the picture. The regional breakdown is where the data becomes genuinely revelatory. The Basque people stand apart from every other population in Spain by a wide and measurable margin. They carry the highest levels of Neolithic farmer and hunter-gatherer ancestry and the lowest North African signal of any region on the peninsula. The closest living genetic link to the people who inhabited pre-Bronze Age Iberia before the steppe migrations arrived. Andalusia sits at the opposite end of the spectrum, carrying the strongest North African and Middle Eastern signal in the country, a direct and measurable reflection of its centuries at the geographic and political heart of Al-Andalus. Galicia and Asturias show notably elevated steppe ancestry. Catalonia and Valencia show ancestry patterns, consistent with broader Mediterranean populations. Central Spain tracks close to the national average. No corner of Spain is genetically simple. No region is clean. Every part of the peninsula carries the layered fingerprints of multiple distinct civilizations deposited quietly on top of one another across thousands of years of movement, conquest, settlement, intermarriage, conversion, and expulsion. So what does this mean for the way we understand Spain and its people? It means that the comfortable, simplified version of Iberian identity, the one built around a single founding culture, a single language, a single moment of national origin, is a story that biology has now permanently complicated. And that complication is not a problem for Spain. It is the truth of Spain. Every wave of people who arrived on the peninsula left something irreversible behind. The Ice Age hunters left a genetic thread still measurable today in Basque villages. The Anatolian farmers laid the biological foundation that still makes up the largest single piece of the modern Spanish genome. The steppe herders rewrote the paternal lineage of the entire peninsula within a few hundred years. The Romans connected Iberia to the genetic flows of an empire, stretching from Britain to the Middle East. The communities of Al-Andalus wove a genetic bridge to North Africa that lasted 1,000 years and was visible in Christian cemeteries centuries after historians thought it had ended. None of these waves erased what came before it completely. Each one mixed into the existing population, argued with it biologically, and produced something new. The 2025 research from Huddersfield showed us one more layer that nobody fully understood before. That even mass forced expulsion, even organized ethnic cleansing leaves a genetic shadow behind in the bones of people who stayed, converted, blended in, and were buried in the wrong cemetery for the right reason. DNA does not honor the borders that politics draws. It does not recognize the religious conversions that power demands. It simply records who was present for how long and in what proportion. And what it records about Spain is a story far older, far more layered, far more honestly complicated, and far more genuinely fascinating than the version that was taught in classrooms for a century. If you are a person with Spanish roots, or Portuguese, or Latin American ancestry tracing back to the Iberian Peninsula, the cells in your body are carrying fragments of all of these people simultaneously. The Ice Age hunter, the Anatolian farmer, the steppe herder, the Roman legionary, the communities of Al-Andalus. Pieces of all of them are sitting inside you right now, quietly coexisting in the most literal way possible. The identity that grows out of all those layers is not fragile, and it does not need a single simple founding story to be real and powerful. It is built from thousands of years of collision, survival, transformation, and endurance. Every layer that was added changed the story, and none of them ended it. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from, and whether any of this changed how you think about the history buried underneath the land we call Spain. Subscribe if you want to keep following the science that is rewriting what we thought we knew about where we all actually come from.